So I had just pointed out the incredible division of labor in Inuit society. It's very strictly defined, very clear to the Inuit. But while this division of labor is incredibly clearly and carefully defined, the bodies that fulfill that division of labor are not necessarily so clearly defined, and this is where things start getting complicated, because of course, and I'm not the first person to point this out, but I picked up on it. Of course, women who've inherited men's names are taught and can perform and undertake all the men's activities. They're often extremely good and competent hunters. Less is said about this, but it's also true that men who inherit women's names are again taught some of the skills that women have, and they can also be incredibly good at skin working and sewing and that kind of thing as well. So in fact, some of the finer, I guess they're tailors in the north, are men who have women's names and who've learned those skills. So the body doesn't necessarily tell you where they fit on this clearly defined division of labor. But I think the point that struck me in this is that when they're children, when you have Inuit children, and I think there was that marvelous thesis that one of Frédéric's students did, and whose name just slipped out of my mind, but okay, that marvelous thesis where he talks about forming a human being out of a fetus, and all of the work that has to go through forming a human out of a fetus, and he takes it as far as when they're about 2 or 3 years old. They've got their clothing. They're starting to get into some of the first catch stuff, and he's talking about that.
That was Fabien Pernet.
It was Fabien. That's right. Thank you. Yes, a wonderful thesis where he develops all of those ideas, and the point about it is that I take from his work, and I take from a lot of other work, is that from an Inuit point of view, we don't just naturally grow up. It just doesn't just happen. You actually have to make human beings. You have to make men. You have to make women. Okay? So in that first stage, which Fabien was talking about, where you're making humans, and with the names, the children are brought up according to the gender of the last person who held the name. So there are lots of little boys with vulvas who are being brought up to go hunting and to participate with their father's activities and do all of that kind of stuff. There are lots of little girls with penises. Well, not lots. It's a percentage, but little girls with penises who are being taught to sew and to do the house care and that kind of stuff. So you have, during the childhood, you have this formation going on of them according to the gender of their name. But as you begin to approach puberty, and it doesn't exactly line up with puberty, but as you begin to approach puberty, another process I think begins to enter, and this is where Fabien stops, is where you begin to fashion, out of these children, you begin to fashion them into men, or you begin to fashion them into women. And this is where some of the more classical stuff that we've seen in the literature comes out, like for boys, they have to have caught one of each of the major animals, and even if they don't catch each of the major animals, there are all kinds of substitutes that allow you to do that. So they have to have developed a certain level of hunting skills. And I saw this, by the way, in Arctic Bay when I was there. One of the good things about going to church was at the end of church, inevitably somebody would stand up. I remember her name was Tugak standing up one day in church and saying, "My husband just caught his first caribou. I want everybody to come up to my house and we're going to eat my husband's first caribou." Of course, she's referring to her grandchild who had her husband's name, right? And he was about 11 or 12 at the time. He just got his first caribou. He had, and so she was basically throwing this celebration and feeding the whole town, or whoever showed up, including your hungry anthropologist, whoever showed up feeding this food to them. Just a little point there, and it's one that is in the literature, but I don't think is noticed very much, is that the boy himself does not eat any of that animal himself. He has to give up the entire thing to the community. I think this notion of giving up the entire thing to the community is very, very important. And then it's distributed as far as whoever will show up and eat it. So I saw that kind of thing happening all the time. That's just one story. And I remember later on when I was working in Pennock, you'd go into houses and you'd see bird skins nailed up on the wall. And and I asked what the bird skins were, and they were signifying the first catches of the sons of the family, the various sons. So it's still very, very significant to Inuit, and it always has been. And that process of catching the first of every major game. Now, by the way, brackets around that, polar bears are usually not included in that particular round of things. Walruses are a bit dodgy on whether they're included, but all the other major game. That process it's through that process that a child is made into a man. Similarly, for women, we know that traditionally they had to acquire a kudluk and learn how to use a kudluk. They had to learn how to process skins. And by the way, I'm not saying any of these are easy. Had to learn how to process skins. And normally they had to be able to make their first full set of clothing in order to demonstrate that they're a woman. Traditionally, I don't want to get into all the symbolism around it, but also they would be tattooed at that stage in life. The other thing then this is to me interesting, the other thing that the girls had to demonstrate was that they in fact could have children. And so you find in the literature that there's a sense of girls having children at a very, very young age. Now, that didn't always work out very well, but it happened at a very young age. But part of it was that they actually had to demonstrate that they could do this. It was a rather critical thing. The other thing about that is, and the logics are tricky in here and could be disputed. But the other thing about that is that when the girls had their first child at a young age, they inevitably gave it up for adoption. And if you talk to the adults, they always say, oh, well, she's too young to know how to look after it. She's not capable of looking after it, so we took it over and we looked after it, and that's fine. Yeah, but in the same way that a boy gives up all of his first catch to the community, a girl gives up the first thing that she produces or reproduces, her first child, to the community. There's a parallelism there, which I think is inevitable. And so it's through those various processes that you make women out of children. They don't just grow up and become men or women. They are made. And I think I don't know if that's distinct to Inuit, but that's certainly important for Inuit. And so for Inuit, your gender, in a certain stage, in a certain way, your gender is also defined by, if I can put it this way, your performance. What you do continues to perform or continues to demonstrate your gender. So the fact that you keep on hunting or you demonstrate skills in hunting tells everybody that you're a man. The fact that you are able to fashion clothes and continue to work skins and fashion clothes continues to tell everybody that you're a woman. So that when we talk about the division of labor, it's not so much that men do this and women do this. It's much more that because you are able to undertake these you have to flip it around. Because you perform these certain activities, you are a man. Because you perform these certain activities, you are a woman. Which of course leaves some room in there for those people for the men with women's names and the women with men's names, who can actually move back and forth across those categories. I always like to say that one of the problems with me being an anthropologist is that, in hunting, I can't hit the broadside of a barn. I'm useless. I'm just terrible. But I can bake a pretty good batch of cinnamon buns, and I'm very good at childcare and keeping the kids under go. So when I was up north, I'm a young guy at 23 to 25, right? I couldn't perform male adult activities. And I was pretty good at doing a lot of the female adult activities. So in some ways, it was very unclear to Inuit what I was. My gender was not obviously defined to them. And I always chuckle because with Inuit in the kamiks, in the sealskin boots, on the boots, the men's stripes are always vertical, and the women's stripes are always horizontal. They go around, okay? My boots don't have any stripes on them. And they made them for me that way, right? So my boots tell you that we don't know, I can tell you it does quite a bit to your mind when you spent 2 years with the people who, especially at that stage in one's life, and when you think you're beginning to, consolidate your masculinity, you spend 2 years with a bunch of people who actually don't agree with you and proceed to deconstruct that. It's not very good for your, thinking about who you are as a person. But anyway, so I think the critical thing is that there is a very clear division of labor in Inuit society. The bodies who can fulfill that division of labor, there are other complexities or criteria that go into that division of labor. And so what again struck me about Bernard's third gender is that didn't help again understand and explain that fact. And what struck me as more important is amongst the Inuit is not so much that these categories are fixed and closed, but rather that you can move between them. You can actually move back and forward. And so when you're being a woman, you're being a woman. When you're being a man, you're being a man. But a particular body can move back and forward between those two positions. All right? So to me, Inuit, and I think this is actually quite unique, Inuit gender is much more about transition, transformation, and context than it is about any kind of fixed categories. And that the whole thing, and I visualize this, if you take the images from Boaz and Diogenes when they draw out the drawings of traditional igloos, complexes of igloos, where they have two igloos beside each other with their tunnels joining together, right, which allows you to go into either one of the two igloos. That's how I mentally visualize this. That the two igloos are sort of the male and the female, but there are passages that adjoin them that you can move back and forward through the passages from one to the other. So it's a different kind of conceptualization of what gender is. To me, it reads the ethnographic data more coherently than imposing a notion like the third gender into it. But this also is where polar bears come in, again, because polar bears are the animal that can do that moving back and forward. They are the transition animal. They are the one that can be both, neither, move back and forward. That's why they're such a good shaman familiar. And so my thinking about polar bears in relationship to gender is that they actually in a sign kind of represent that ability to transform, to transition, okay, and to move. And so that's why I called that article, and I wrote an article called "The Gender of the Bear." Actually, it was kind of funny on the title of that because you may have been one of the reviewers, but I won't ask. One of the reviewers said they really didn't like the title and they wanted the title changed. And so, being a very obedient writer, I changed the title. And when I sent it back to the editor of the journal, the editor of the journal phoned me up and said, "Why did you change the title?" I said, "Well, the reviewer told me to change the title. They didn't like the title." "Oh, I don't care about that. I really like that title. We're leaving it at The Gender of the Bear." So that's why the title, but I actually think it is a good title because it that's what it's talking about. What it's suggesting, or what I hope it suggests, is that you're dealing with two fairly large and complex symbolic systems that layer over each other in a number of very particular ways. Having said that they layer over each other in particular ways doesn't mean that there aren't parts that are, outside of this schema, but that they lay over each other in a particular way, and they provide a kind of symbolic vocabulary that allow you to talk about this kind of transformational quality of gender and the kind of gendered qualities of bears. So to me, that's what that whole argument was all about, and I thought that was. It's quite different from anything else I've seen in the literature. It's a fundamental disagreement with Bernard over the understanding of gender. He's never taken it badly. I don't know that he's ever really noticed how fundamental the disagreement is, but it's a very, very different way of looking at it. And I think the other thing that I realize that this is my interpretive theory around this stuff, but I think the other thing that's quite kind of interesting about it is that it kind of upholds the uniqueness of the Inuit. In the meantime, once I began thinking about this, I went and read a huge amount of the literature on gender that's out there, and it's a pretty massive literature now. I read a huge amount of that literature, and I found nowhere else in that literature talking about this kind of transformative, transitional, contextual notion of gender. Most of the stuff, and actually I saw something in the paper yesterday that says, First Nations have 5 genders. Well, okay, but I don't know that that's particularly helpful to say that. It may be true, but I never saw anywhere else. Everybody was so busy trying to categorize and create these kind of bounded notions around gender. Even if there were 3rd, 4th, 5th genders, they were trying to create these kind of bounded notions. And I never really saw anywhere else in the literature this notion that, well, maybe they're not nice, neat, contained categories. Maybe they are categories where some people in the world, not everybody, where some people in the world can actually move, can actually transition. And again, my reading of the literature is that nobody else has ever pointed that out anywhere else. And I think it says something quite profound about the Inuit and about how the Inuit understand maleness, femaleness, the relationship between people and moving back and forward between them. And I still encounter that kind of thing. I just want to give you one little example. There was a young woman from Pangniptok who was a very close friend of mine. I've known her since she was 12 years old. And she had got married. She was pregnant. There were difficulties with her pregnancy. It turned out she had a cyst on her ovary, and the baby was sitting on top of the cyst. So she had to come to Winnipeg to have the child, to deliver the child. And so she stayed with me for the month before her pregnancy, or before the birth. And I was supposed to be the sort of coach on this thing. Thank goodness my wife showed up the night that her water broke, and we took her into hospital to give birth to the baby. And so my wife ended up being the coach on this thing. But halfway through the process, it was a long delivery, but halfway through the process, my wife came out to me and said, what's wrong with this woman? Doesn't she understand what's going on inside of her? And I said, well, no, because she's a boy. Now, my wife has heard me talk about these things enough that she knows what I'm talking about. She said, oh, one of those, okay, we just go back and we make this happen. But it was really interesting that this young woman who was full-term pregnancy, giving birth to a child, she just did not know. And yet she was performing, if I can say it, was performing the ultimate woman's function. I recognize most women would not like to be reduced to that, but it's certainly the one thing that women can do that men can't do. And she had no idea what was going on. She had no idea what was happening inside of her. most of the time, she's a young man, but she was in labor. And so there was this incredible sort of slippery sliding of categories. And to me, that helps you understand what was going on at that particular moment, rather than closing it off. So I think that there's a lot to say around that model.